there an alien in your podcast too? Welcome everyone to Super Audio Robo Podcast Z. It's the show where we recommend you the finest mecha content for your cultural and artistic development, as well as adding to your sense of bravery and courage.
And trust me, after this episode, you're going to feel about 120% more braver after this.
This is the Brave series. This is our fourth and final of our big overview episodes to start off this podcast. It's interesting bringing this up because this is definitely one of those things I put on the list that was very much kind of more of a me thing.
Yeah.
Because, but when it comes to the previous topics, we're pretty much on the same wavelength when it comes to, our knowledge of Mazinger and, Dynamic Pro super robots as a whole. Gundam, I definitely defer to you more in terms of general knowledge and experience. You've obviously seen, a lot more of, the major entries in that franchise. And then with Macross, we're familiar with the same content up to a point, and then basically stuff from the 2000s onwards is where I've actually watched it and you haven't. The Brave series, meanwhile, we only have one show in common from it that we have ever actually watched, and then I have just been working for the past few years, slowly and at my own pace, because as you'll find, these are not easy to binge shows in the slightest, but going back through the previous history of this short-lived but still weirdly influential series of super robot anime that, has more of an impact, maybe not so much, in the whole world, as it were, but in Japan, you definitely see more of its influence than you might first expect.
Yeah, I am definitely coming into this new because I will just say it right now. 90% of these shows I have not watched. I've only watched the one.
Everyone knows the one if you're into super robots.
Oh yeah, it's Gao Gaigar. I'm just going to say it right now.
But obviously we can't start with just Gao Gaigar because that was actually the last of these animated Brave series. So we have to actually get to explaining what the hell is the Brave series by starting all the way at the beginning with the show that started it all. And this is how it goes. Cosmic life forms that protect the galaxy arrive on Earth in pursuit of a band of space pirates known as the Geisters, who intend to plunder the planet of its treasures. In order to achieve their goals, both the Space Police Kaisers and Geisters possess inanimate objects to become transforming robots. One of them inhabits the car belonging to a young boy's family, and here that boy witnesses the robot's heroism firsthand. His name is X-Kaiser, the first of many Braves in a series that would endure for decades to come. Simple, to the point kind of plot, good versus evil. I mean, what's not to love?
Yeah, it is. It sounds as simple as it comes. And also, the whole thing about aliens turning into transforming vehicles is it's a thing I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with as well.
That actually makes for a very nice segue into our prehistory, because to talk about the history of the Brave series requires some knowledge of the history of the Transformers.
Yeah.
Transformers is obviously well known, but you'll find when we get to more of this in detail, you'll see there is a reason why we don't have a Transformers dedicated episode. It's giant robots, obviously. We love those, but it's obviously approaching it from a very different lens, especially at this point in time. But specifically, as far as the history of the Transformers, it has more to do with the toy company that had collaborated with Hasbro very early in the franchise's life. Because depending on how, knowledgeable you are of Transformers, you may or may not realize that it is heavily tied to collaboration with, Japanese toy makers. Takara had already made their own transforming robot toy line in the form of Diaclone, right at the start of the 80s. And many of those designs were used as part of the first generation Transformers toys. That said, though, in Japan, at this point, this is in the late 80s, Transformers brand was starting to see a bit of decline. Not so much of the way that where it would have been it's so unpopular, no one knows what it is anymore. It's definitely something where there was a desire for Takara and the Toei, who is also contributing on the animation side of the whole arrangement, to break away from Hasbro entirely. A move that is I think, as history has vindicated, is a totally right thing to do.
That was the smart decision, I think.
But also, even with them wanting to break away from that, there was still that desire to be man, we still want our own transforming robot toy line that also has an animated property that can run side by side so that they synergize and advertise each other, and we can maximize on sales and TV viewer ratings. That makes sense.
From what I understand, when we talked about Mazinger, Gundam, or like Macross, they're not really focused on the merchandising aspect, but this one is way more focused on that. I'm making toys for
Yeah,
for people to buy.
like if you really wanted to know, like, I guess, like, where the sort of exaggerated conception or misconception about like robot anime just being like elaborate toy commercials came from, a lot of it just comes from, I'm pretty sure, explicitly like just international fans that have been more familiar with Transformers and like have had clued in much early on to the fact that this is just how Hasbro has done it.
Yeah.
So they always assumed that this was the case back in the 70s, when it was like, no, the merchandise was more the toys, the merchandisers were like the sponsors, and it's just like there's some amount of needing to throw a bone to the sponsors with, like, you know, designs and concepts that would make for good toys, but it was never a thing where it was like the sponsors came in with a toy idea and was like, we want you, animation studio, to make us a cartoon that can help us sell these toys. That was never the goal.
Yeah.
That was only the goal with Transformers, and obviously those lessons bled off onto Takara, that they were like, yeah, we should actually do that here. So to accomplish this, Takara made a cooperative deal with Studio Sunrise, already having made a name for itself in the 80s thanks to the success of Gundam and just like all the variety of real robot anime that they had produced in that entire decade, effectively defining that decade. Like in the process, like, yeah, Transformers was like never really like a super niche thing even in Japan, but like to say that it was like anywhere as popular as Gundam would be like,
No.
we just be flat out wrong, really. Like it's still very clear what was at the forefront of popular consciousness in Japan during this time.
Yeah, Gundam was pretty much the top dog. It's hard to like mention how big its influence, but it's big, y'all. I mean, we had an whole episode about it.
But yes, Sunrise, they would be tasked with animating a year-long anime series with Takara producing the toys based on it. And that obviously means, you know, the toys themselves and like whatever design ideas for how they wanted to convey them in anime would be like having those two companies working a lot closer with each other, to the point where it's like you could definitely see in some spots where some of the things that Sunrise would put into the Brave series very early on was very much at the behest of Takara wanting to capitalize on a concept for a Transformer that they maybe didn't get to because they had broken off the deal with Hasbro before it got to that point. We'll definitely mention that one particular example. But yes, it's very clear the cause of the transforming toys was not new at this point.
No.
And even the story origin for Brave X Kaiser's robots is extremely similar to Transformers. Like, replace Cybertronians with, like, literal spirits that possess objects. And, like, it's more or less the same. But it still stands out. And I think this is the big reason why we're talking about this instead of Transformers in general, is because Transformers doesn't really imbue a lot of, like, the super robot isms, the functions and aesthetics like that were so prevalent in Japan in the 70s, which the Brave series ultimately saw as an opportunity to bring back. And I think this is something that is actually very good and important to get into when considering we're talking about the previous decade at this point. The entire 80s was so dominated by real robots. You saw super robots here and then, but they had so fallen out of favor. The most you had seen is, as far as TV anime super robots, was like very early in the 80s, back before people got the memo that Gundam was the hot shit.
Yeah.
And then moving to things like, you know, like Gunbuster or Dankuga, where it's like, yeah, there's a lot of super robot narratives tropes at play, but you're still following the trends of like, we need to have more realistic and like down-to-earth mechanisms to govern these robots. There wasn't really anything anymore in the same tricolor over-the-top style that you saw with super robots back in the 70s.
Yeah, you could definitely see the tides turn around here.
Yeah, which I think makes it pretty interesting as far as the fact that, like, Brave X Kaiser, when it aired, it was about at the start of the 90s, essentially. Like, a good way to start not just the new decade, but also, you know, like, the new era in Japan, because the Showa era was going to conclude and transition into the Heisei era. And highlighting as well just another thing that is, I think, important and has helped keep mecha as like a genre so prevalent in Japan, even if it is not like, even if most people around the world don't really understand the significance, but it's the fact that like every like decade or two, there's enough creators out there that understand that the old audience has been growing up with the same stuff that we've been making now.
Yeah.
And that's starting to leave behind the new audience that would be about the same age that our old audience would have been back when they were watching this shit in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that there are still people, you know, new young people growing up that are able to see the appeal of like what these giant robots are, because the audience is growing up and the works in question are growing up, which is why like this is going to become quite an interesting standout in the decade of the 90s, because you compare it to a lot of other like seminal works in the genre during the 90s, and some of those are way darker. They are clearly aiming for a much different audience than what the Brave series is going for. And if I think there's any way to define what the 90s was for the mecha genre, it is definitely the balancing of like both the new and old sensibilities. But yeah, I think even then with that, it's a little discussion theorizing about just like kind of what the state of pop culture in Japan, maybe getting a bit ahead of myself, but I felt it was still important to highlight all the same. I do think it's important to think about this stuff, especially when we're talking about a medium that has its roots in another country.
Yeah, because
so it's better to look at it from like how they probably perceived it rather than just what us filthy gaijin probably think. So yes, in addition to the Brave series basically incorporating the Transformers concept with super robot functions, aesthetics, and just bringing it back in force, they also did something that like G1 Transformers was definitely not taking the time to focus on, and that was highlighting more the relationship between the robots and human characters. Anyone that is familiar or has seen some of like the G1 Transformers cartoon from the 80s, like, it's a bunch of fucking nonsense.
Yeah, it makes no sense nowadays. It's kind of that show was insane if you go back to it.
Fucking Optimus Prime playing b-ball for no goddamn reason is like, what is this going on? And then you just have a couple episodes where you're suddenly reminded, oh wait, yeah, there's supposed to be a human character in this. What the hell? Who the hell remembers the Witwickies?
There's Spike and his dad. Remember those guys? Kinda, but not really.
And it's funny too, because I believe it was like it was either an OVA that got made or it didn't get made, but it had it as the initial concept like way late in the 80s for Transformers, where they were going to like actually push this kind of narrative concept with having more of like the actual developed dynamic between a human character and the Transformers. So X Kaiser decided then to just take this opportunity to place a lot more emphasis on like the main character, you know, like a third grader, like a small boy, is like a vital member of the cast who knows the robots' identities, you know, helps them out, like tells them about Earth's culture, what they value, etc., and things like that. A lot of stuff similar to Transformers on the surface, but like key differentiators that would, I'd say even then, would eventually find their way back into Transformers in like a very circular sort of manner.
Yeah, which I'm sure we'll probably mention later on.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about like the Unicron trilogy for a brief moment, just because I had firsthand experience with one of those shows, somewhat regrettably, maybe up to your interpretation. But to like wrap up just the prehistory and like what went into like the original Brave X Kaiser, the start of the Brave series. You know, this being at Sunrise, he obviously had like some key personnel that would like leave an indelible effect. Obviously, you know, Kunio Okuwara is like the big mecha designer at Sunrise, worked on Gundam as well as a bunch of other shit. And unsurprisingly, like a lot of like the core designs for like, you know, like working with Takara to like create like the robots themselves, Okuwara was definitely on top of that stuff as well. So you can absolutely see in some of the designs that it has like the familiar shapes of like the limbs. Like every robot has like the same side skirt, front skirts, kind of flaps that, you know, a mobile suit would have, that sort of thing. But obviously everything's much more exaggerated and colorful. Brave X Kaiser would be directed by Katsuyoshi Yatabe, which would not be his only input on the Brave series. He would direct the two following anime, which goes to show how the series would very quickly evolve and develop itself. But more than that, there were some very important animators that made a name for themselves that would like also have an influence on not just Sunrise, but also like their own like independent works following this. And the big one is Masami Obari. Like, what can we fucking say about Obari himself? Like how can you not know this man? or maybe you don't know, but if you need to know, this is a man with some of the most stylish, most sickest fucking robot poses and dynamic animations you will ever fucking see in your life.
Yeah, there is an entire pose named after him. If you have ever seen an anime character pose with a sword, where it's very dynamic and very like, I don't know how else to describe it, but
it's like he holds the sword like at waist level.
Yeah.
And it is pointing towards the camera in a way where the sense of perspective is super exaggerated, that the tip becomes ginormous.
Yeah, and that came from the Brave series, and I think it's called the Obari pose, but it's also called like the Brave pose or something, right?
The Brave pose was definitely what it was first known as because of it originating from here. I think there was definitely a point where it eventually got adapted to being like it's the Sunrise pose because other works produced by Sunrise definitely adopted it, but it became so widespread everywhere after that. Like not just at Sunrise and not even just in Mecha. Like you'll see Magical Girls or like other shit just do that exact same pose because it is sick as hell.
It's so cool. Just look it up and you'll know.
Yeah, naturally it obviously had its name finally finished to being like, oh yeah, it's just the Obari pose. Yeah. It's named for this guy. And even Obari uses it so much and is fully aware that he reuses all his same poses. But it's an admission of like, this could be seen as creative bankruptcy, that I'm just leveraging the same old shit I did decades ago, but fuck it, you all still love it.
Hey, if I created such an iconic pose, I'd fucking like milk that shit as much as I can. I'd be like, yeah.
Iconic poses, iconic like animations, and obviously a lot of the combination sequences, which the Brave series is also extremely well known for. Everything from the beginning up through the 6th series in the entire franchise all had key animation for like the combinations and like openings and such done by Obari in like varying capacities. And like kind of extending from that, as far as another animator, it might as well be worth mentioning this. Mitsuo Fukuda also worked to provide key animation for the Brave series. And yes, I know, that is the same Mitsuo Fukuda of Gundam Seed fame.
Yeah.
He also did Cyber Formula GPX and Gear Fighter Dendo. And Grendizer U, which was another fantastic, one of the 2 fantastic anime of 2024. It's funny, like these 2 names, I just realized, Obari and Fukuda, is like, how crazy is it that they started here at the Brave series and then like decade and a half later would fucking go on to direct like the best animes of 2024.
Oh yeah, they're still directing even now. Like these people have not went anywhere.
Just let this be a point that in the case of Fukuda, because we know how much like Seed is just not good, especially Seed Destiny and just everything else about Cosmic Era, that, you know, maybe, just maybe, Mitsuo Fukuda is a talented enough individual that it's fine to have him work on stuff as long as he's not touching Gundam. Let's just leave it at that.
Maybe he's good when he's just not involved there and he doesn't have to make like hundreds of episodes or something.
Yeah, or like just have a gross misunderstanding of the source material that he's working with.
I love Universal Century, but worse.
But that's everything that went into the start of Brave X Kaiser, the origin of the Brave series. So now you know what we got to talk about, and this is going to be where it's very exciting. We got to talk about the robots, the Brave robots. And that obviously starts with our titular Brave robot, X Kaiser. Talking about these robots, you'll see, like, kind of as we break them down, that this kind of sets the standard for what was going to be, like, not just the main character robot, naturally, but there's a whole cast of other robots that support them, that you start to see, like, the default team composition and, like, mechanisms that they kind of abide by for a few series starting out before they start introducing a lot more shakeups just to keep it fresh. But to start, you have X Kaiser as the leader of the group itself, the Space Police Kaisers. His vehicle form is the Hoshikawa family's car, which is to give an extra little detail if anyone is still racking their brains on why I landed on that opening line and like modified it. That is because of the fact that like the first episode highlights the fact that yes, the main human character, his family's car is possessed by an alien, and at the end of every episode, on the next episode preview, he asks the audience, "Is there an alien in your car too?"
Oh yeah, that's what your opening line was referencing. That
Yeah, I felt like it was the best to do, considering a lot of the discussion is going to be about establishing what Brave X Kaiser was about, because this design and all the other members of the Brave Police Kaisers are like, I have thoughts about X Kaiser as a show and like the degree to which it is watchable. But I do believe that this show has like some of the most iconic designs of like the entire series. Like its hallmark is absolutely setting like the baseline for this is what the Brave robots should be. But when it transforms, you know, it's got white, red, blue, like gold accents, you know, very familiar colors that had existed in 70s Super Robots, but, you know, kind of the distribution of those colors has shifted a little. Like white is more predominant now. And X Kaiser in its robot form has a big old lion face emblazoned on its chest.
Yeah.
Because what better way to represent it than an animal that is synonymous with the concept of courage?
And I think the animal thing is like something they do for like all the Brave series, right?
Yes, not explicitly a lion, but they do like have a lion show up in like some instances. Like I at least know there are two Brave robots where by default they do not have the lion motif, but their ultimate final combination includes it.
Yeah.
But others will have, you know, like a phoenix motif. Other robots, not the main ones, but supports one, will have like a tiger motif, etc. Things like that. Animals that like convey like just something that is like super cool to young kids.
Yeah.
And as X Kaiser is the leader, that means he gets all the big fancy combinations, of which there are multiple. Like you get introduced very early on that the way X Kaiser's combinations work is that he has a giant support vehicle that he fuses with, and you can obviously see how it would work as a toy. As for the question of whether it could be accurately replicated in terms of like poses and dynamics in toy form, absolutely not. No. There's clearly some playing with scale and like other like fuckery that they're doing with like transforming mass and whatnot. But you at least see the general idea of, you know, how the car transforms into X Kaiser and how X Kaiser then combines with his big support vehicles. The first of which is King Rotor, which is like a gigantic like truck trailer that transforms and folds out, combines with X Kaiser to create King X Kaiser. Still has the lion motif on the chest, but it's obviously a lot fancier and more bigger and beefier. And that's at the start. The second combination is introduced halfway through when X Kaiser gets the Dragon Jet, combines with it to become Dragon Kaiser. Yeah, obviously a dragon motif now instead of a lion, and has like a different like finishing move entirely. Like actually has like archery as like a main method of attack. And then as it gets near the end, you gotta have your great combination, as I call it, as a lot of these Brave robots, as you'll find, have great included in their full title. And that is Great X Kaiser, where while he's in King X Kaiser form, basically combined with the King Rotor, the Dragon Jet splits apart and then combines its individual pieces on top of King X Kaiser. And it's fucking massive. And that's just our leader. That was just all we had to say about X Kaiser, who, by the way, as just the last thing, he's voiced by Sho Hayami.
Oh, you'll be very familiar with, even if you're not now, you will be familiar the more you listen to us talk about these series.
We definitely went on a bit about Sho Hayami during the Macross episode, as he is everyone's favorite interspecies marriage candidate.
The first spacebooker, as you put it.
Yep, the original. And he does a very good job at making a very simple but appealing heroic figure, you know, someone that people that would be watching this show as a young kid could look up to. I mean, I would. But we got to get to the rest of the Brave robots that support X Kaiser. We have the Raker brothers, who I'm going to say are part of Team 1, because like in addition to the leader character, you basically have like 2 support teams of robots, and each team essentially is able to combine itself into one giant robot. The Raker brothers are a pair of blue and green Shinkansen trains, And, they can transform into robots like anything else, but they have the ability to combine into one single robot in a manner that will, immediately start, tingling the back of your brain if you are at any all familiar with the concept of symmetrical docking.
That's I was just thinking that sounds like a Gal Geiger thing.
Yeah, and funny enough, despite it being here, there weren't really any other Brave series between this and Gal Geiger where they revisited that same symmetrical combination process.
That is a surprise that no other show tried doing that other than Gal Geiger.
Yeah, they definitely did a lot more of iterating on a lot of the other type of combination and transforming mechanisms with other teams in the Brave series. But I think the other thing, especially with the Raker brothers and why their combination is so distinct, is because I forget the name of what toy was supposed to be, but this was a concept for the original Transformers that Takara was wanting to make before they had basically split from Hasbro at the end of the 80s. So this was their way of making good on that original concept they had.
Right.
And the combination for the name is Ultra Raker. One side of it is green, the other side's blue. It is big, and every part of its body looks like it is just a bunch of mangled subway trains. But whatever, it's awesome. It skates along the ground and has yo-yo based attacks. And lastly, the second support team, we have the Max team. It is a robot trio whose their vehicle forms are a race car belonging to Dash Max, a fighter jet belonging to Sky Max, and a drill tank belonging to Drill Max. And yes, drill tanks are not real, but screw it, this is a kids anime. Drills are cool.
It's cool, shut up.
They needed a third vehicle so that they could better cover the range of terrain that they would be able to scout. One on the surface, other in the air. I guess they wanted to avoid the issue that Getter 3 always had, in that how often does the Getter Robo team ever get into a fight underwater?
Almost never, from what I learned.
Yeah, so they decided, well, fuck it, we're gonna be more on land and away from water more often. We might as well make a subterranean robot.
Yeah.
But as you would expect, these three combine, and the combination, as you would expect, is a lot more traditional and standard compared to, what the Raker brothers demonstrate, as this is very much all three of them combining in a way where they are stacked on top of each other. Their bodies change into the different limbs that make up the final form of God Max. Pretty sick name, if I have to say.
God Max is a really good name for a combination robot.
Yes. We've obviously explained enough about, what the vehicle forms for these robots are, how they combine, what their names are. But it's I do urge everyone at home, either if you're, watching the video version of this or to check the supplementary images for the podcast elsewhere. It's do look up the designs for these robots. They are genuinely great. They are the real star of the show, even when everything else is, very much... It's very clear just from how we've described a lot of things, even with how this is very much an explicit collaboration with a company wanting to sell toys.
Yeah.
You could see where this was going. And that becomes even more apparent when we get into our antagonists, the Geisters. Because, oh boy, imagine if the Decepticons were the Dinobots and were just as intelligent.
And those are our villains, huh?
Yes. Although I will say that the leader of our villains is a bit more intimidating than that. Let's get into the list now real quickly. We got Dino Geist. He's our antagonist, the leader of the Geisters. Two interesting things with him is that as far as his robot design and functionality, he's actually the only one in the show who is a triple changer. He has obviously a humanoid robot form. He has a dinosaur form, which is very T-Rex-like, although I feel it's the proportions and such makes it feel a lot more like Mechagodzilla, and also can turn into a giant jet. So yeah, that's his third form. The third form, most people didn't even know at the start because throughout the entire runtime of X-Kaiser, he does not actually fight until the halfway point. He's just sitting in his lair scheming. You barely see his body in full frame until he suffered enough defeats and X-Kaiser calls him out on his shit that he's like, fuck it, I'll do it myself.
That's crazy because that's like if Megatron didn't show up in G1 Transformers until like the halfway point or something.
Yeah, like imagine like if there was a push in G1 Transformers to have Megatron be a much more enigmatic figure than he was. Like that is unthinkable for so many Transformers fans because that's just not the dynamic that he has with like the major characters that he has in those series, which is predominantly Optimus Prime, who he hates, and Starscream, who he loves to hate. But the rest of the Geisters, there is Komori, who doesn't really fight. He's just a little robot bat that relays orders from Dino Geist to the rest of his underlings, and usually has to do so in a way where the words that he relays are often insulting to the rest of the Geisters, and in order to not, have them shoot the messenger, he has to go, that's just what Dino Geist said. Because the rest of the Geisters are who you become familiar with throughout most of the show, and let's break them down. There's Horngeist, a robot that takes the form of a Triceratops. Dumb as bricks. Armorgeist, a robot that takes the form of a Stegosaurus. Also dumb as bricks. Terrageist, a robot that takes the form of a pterodactyl. Dumb as bricks, but marginally smarter than his colleagues. Marginally. And lastly, Thundergeist, a robot that takes the form of an Apatosaurus. Unbelievably dumb as bricks. This is what our heroes have to fight every week.
I'm kind of seeing a pattern with these robots in that they all sound really ineffectual.
Yes. A lot of the time is just spent with them in an underground lava-filled cavern, watching a giant TV embedded in the cavern wall, looking at news broadcasts, just to see, like, what is the big thing right now among humans? What is a treasure that they can steal? And sometimes, sometimes they go off on, like, some weird tangents where it's like they apparently get the idea in their head that dreams are very important to humans, and it takes them half the episode to realize that dreams are immaterial and they cannot be stolen. And it leads them to being so fucking pissed off. One of them is like, we wasted all this time trying to steal something that isn't physical. Fine, we'll just deprive the humans of sleep so that they can't even get any sweet dreams. Take this, losers.
That is such a... you know what? This feels like a synopsis for like an episode for a kid's show, sure.
You know what would not be a synopsis for a kid's show, at least not a kid's show in America? What? Having them steal a fuck ton of cigarettes because cigarettes are apparently a treasure to adults despite the horrible like health downsides. And it's the only thing that they actually succeed in stealing.
Of all things, cigarettes. That's what they... Fuck.
They proceed to chain smoke a bunch of them.
Oh my God.
Like that fucking meme image of the TF2 spy where it's just his mouth is stuffed with an entire carton, except they're also choking on the smoke. It's like, this is terrible. Why do humans like this?
I'm not even going to ask how giant dinosaur robots can inhale smoke in the first place.
Don't think about it. Also, don't think about the way that they can technically combine, because it is not a combination that works in the same way as like the Brave Police Kaisers, because it happens very rarely, usually kind of honestly in like the last third of the anime. But there are like certain combinations that come up with the underlings of the Geisters, like Horn and Armorgeist can combine into Hormar, and Terra and Thundergeist can combine into Tedder. And then obviously you gotta have a combination where all four of them get just melded together like they came out of the fucking teleporter machine in The Fly, and it's called Madgeister.
Madgeister is also another good name.
It is a good name, better than Hormar or Teddar, which is like I get the idea that they were trying to go for, but it's like it's real messy to try to say, especially when English is your first language.
It's a good attempt. I'm just not sure about them.
Yeah, no wonder you guys didn't like do this combination shit very often. Like they're too busy like just turning other inanimate objects into giant robots that end up being the monster of the week. Because like that's how all their plans effectively go. Like that's where where X Kaiser and his team end up having to like fight, is usually having to fight whatever building or other object has been transformed by the Geisters, which could include things like a giant statue of Santa Claus.
Oh,
in one of the greatest Christmas episodes ever.
Yeah, I guess if you ever saw that image of like a giant Mecha Santa Claus, this is where it came from.
If you ever wondered, where like the shots of a super robot fighting a buff shirtless Santa with like spike like cuffs on his wrists and just shouting ho 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 as he punches the shit out of X-Kaiser, yeah, that's where it's from. He also fuses with a reindeer near the end of the fight. It becomes like a buff shirtless Santa like centaur.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. It's a shame that the show doesn't like have that exact same energy and like creativity for all 48 episodes. I forget. It's close to 50. They're all close to 50.
These shows are not. They are very long. They're all very long.
Yeah, they are designed to follow the same sort of schedule that something like a Super Sentai or a Pretty Cure anime is designed to, where you expect it to go the whole year. But yeah, that's just all the robots. So much time spent with them naturally because this is a very Transformers-like, scenario. They're the stars of the show. But as we mentioned before, there is an emphasis on the human characters, and we can't forget them, such as Kota Hoshikawa, who is the young boy of the Hoshikawa family, third grader. He's the one that discovers that his family's car's been possessed by X-Kaiser and forms a friendship with him, helps him out in his investigations of trying to find like where the Geisters are, what they're possibly trying to steal next, but obviously has to keep their identities a secret, naturally. That's kind of the important thing. Like, actually, funny, imagine that, adhering to the concept of robots in disguise.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that whole concept, they got to stretch that concept really thin in that show.
They do a lot more with it, like, and make it feel more substantial in the subsequent entries, which I think helps, considering that the first 3 entries are all by the same director.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a good case of learning as you go along. But yeah, Kota, he's like the he's the son. He's like the younger sibling in the Hoshikawa family. Like, his father is like a boss at a newspaper company. His mom's a stay-at-home wife who's like kind of oblivious to a lot of things, but is obviously very lovey-dovey with her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And he has an older sister who's in middle school and a brat. Because if you're making a show for young kids who are explicitly young boys, you kind of gotta get in on that idea of just like light antagonism with like your older sibling.
Which, hey, fair.
Although in this case, it's the older sibling that is kind of like being more of the problem, rather than your younger brother character being a full-on Dennis the Menace or some shit. Yeah, because Kota's a good boy. He is very much framed as that because he is supposed to be the audience surrogate in this instance. But other characters that make very frequent appearances is Kotomi Tsukiyama, who is a classmate of Kota and like kind of like a very like young love interest, like someone that he obviously has feelings for. And then there's Takumi Kaniari, who's another classmate and is a rich kid and is one of the 2 sources of like comic relief from the human cast, because of how he tries to like flaunt his wealth by showing like this cool expensive thing he bought with his dad's money, and it just backfires in a way, usually in a way to try and like get Kotomi's attention. But it's the sort of thing where it's like all 3 of them, they're friends, but Takumi is like trying the most to just constantly one up Kota and just be like, I'm rich unlike you peasants, calling him a peasant when his family has a car that looks like it does. Fucking designer sports car looking ass. And then there's Osamu Tokuda to round it out. He's the second source of comic relief. He is a photojournalist at the newspaper company that Kota's dad is the boss of. So that ends up making him, like a friend of the family. And he's a goof who is constantly failing in trying to get the next big scoop. And like anytime he could possibly, get a picture of like a major fight between the Kaisers and the Geisters, something invariably goes wrong, either because of like someone interfering with him directly, or he gets distracted because he is an adult with the mind of a child.
Oh no.
Yeah, very, very carefree. Yeah, and those characters very much just stay that same way for the entire runtime.
Yeah.
Brave X-Kaiser is a show that likes to keep its status quo.
Yeah, you probably have noticed from the way we talk about it, but I am guessing that because the show is more kid-focused, it sounds really formulaic, and it's not exactly going to, like, change or have an ongoing storyline for those 49 episodes.
No, it's like the only major changes and like progression you see is like the beginning where they're introducing your characters, the middle where, you know, all kinds of stuff happens with Dino Geist entering the battle for real, the Dragon Jet being introduced and getting the Dragon Kaiser combo, and then like the latter episodes, I mean, like where they introduce Great X Kaiser, that final combination, and like the finale story arc in like the last 2 to 3 episodes when they're like, oh yeah, we're nearing the end of our runtime, we need to make a proper send off.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's very deliberate, like even by the admission of the production team, is that they were making this as a pure children's program.
Yeah.
And even having watched it, I could say it's like, it's not the worst thing you could watch, but it is not a show made for binging the way that most anime, especially modern anime, is basically made and produced these days. And I think it goes to show as well that like even with that focus, it did ultimately pay off. Because it ensured that the series was able to progress past this first anime for at least several more years. So we might as well get into it now, talking about the Brave's legacy. So, again, for context, the first entry of the Brave series, Brave X Kaiser, aired on Japanese television on February 3rd, 1990. Again, I was not kidding. This was basically like starting off the decade of the 90s as early as it could possibly go. Ran for 48 episodes, concluding on January 26, 1991. And we mentioned as much its goals. It was a show aiming purely at like young children, making it as uncomplicated as possible for them, while also serving the same goal from Takara's standpoint of, you know, getting them interested in these robot toys that they would want to buy them. And not only was it very well received as far as, you know, like TV ratings and reception from viewers, but it fed into what was considered one of Takara's best years in toy sales for like their entire company. Like even compared to after Takara merging with Tomy, because now they're part of that merged entity. Like throughout the entire year, like there was a high demand for X Kaiser toys, and it only started to wane near the end of the 90s when the Super Famicom was released. This is going to be something that you can kind of clue into as to maybe the reason why the Brave series eventually stopped when it did.
Yeah, I think kids might have found like they might find video games a lot more entertaining.
I mean, I sure did.
Yes,
we all did growing up.
Yeah.
But it is the sort of thing where even then there's still some allure to like some cool toy that you want to get anyway that's physical. It's just that at least like when you're a kid, I can definitely say this is how it was from my experience, where it is like as a kid, things that look fun to you can take form in like so many different ways that you kind of dabble in all sorts of things. Like I had video games, I had Transformers, I had Legos, I had all kinds of other stuff, but a lot of it, you know, when you get older, you start to focus a lot more on the stuff that you know you want to just invest more time and money in. Because like tastes and palates start to refine, and in my case, my tastes and palate ultimately refine into video games is where the shit is.
That's where I want to spend all my time on. Yeah.
So toy sales aside, because the show was popular with like its core demographic, it convinced Takara and Sunrise that hey, this anime that we did, it didn't need to be a one-off, you know? So we could follow in the same steps that Toei has done with Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, the latter of which had basically nothing airing in the 90s and would not air again until the 2000s. Again, making it very interesting how the 90s just signaled like its own shifts in like different aspects of pop culture, like at just the right moment. So Sunrise would produce a new Brave series anime year after year, following the same formula, you know, airing for near 50 episodes, like 48 on average, I guess, more exact. And, you know, Takara would naturally be producing more toys that would be based on whatever the new season was, basically. And both feeding into each other as far as, like, this is the toy concepts we want to make, combined with, well, these are the kind of robots we want to create and the stories to tell.
Yeah.
So, following that, we mentioned Katsuyoshi Yatabe. He'd continue as director on the series after X Kaiser. He would direct Brave Fighter of Sun Fibered and The Brave of Legend of Garn. And this is where we'll get into a bit more detail when we talk about it in the subsequent entries. But following off of X Kaiser, while it is a very pure children's program that can be like simple to the point of being to its detriment if you're like an older viewer, that the subsequent entries are acknowledging the fact that, like, if you were someone that watched Brave X Kaiser when it first aired, you are now 1 year older when we're producing this new one, and now another year older when we produce the following.
Yeah.
So there is kind of getting back to that need of, like, we can't keep working on the same thing with the idea of always aiming at the same age demographic. We kind of have to age up with our audience as it goes along before we eventually circle back around to, like, reset to, like, the next generation of young viewers that want to get into this. And you absolutely feel that with Firebird and Dagarn, just each one getting more nuance and drama added to their storylines, because now there's more of an audience trust with, like, you're old enough that you're able to comprehend the seriousness of this. But alas, we all know how the story ends. It did not last past the 90s due to toy sales, gradually and greatly declining by the end. It did not stop the series from, like, leaving a huge mark on audiences and creators alike. Like, many of Masami Obari and Mitsuo Fukuda's work on key animations, like, contributed to so many iconic and dynamic poses, animations that we have, like, talked about already. And, like, they still use them in their own works to this day. And even with, like, only 8 anime being produced in the entire series, with the last one being the one that everyone knows, Gao Gaigar, there were still attempts made by Sunrise to, like, find ways to make more Brave media in any way that they could. So, like, following the final TV anime, there were 2 strategy RPGs for the PS1 known as the Brave Saga. It's not hard to imagine when we describe it this way. It's like, yeah, imagine Super Robot Wars, but, we just had it all focused on the Brave series, as well as some other Sunrise-produced anime like Votoms. Don't question why it's here.
That's crazy. That's like if Rambo, like, crossed over to Transformers or something.
Yeah, like, you have, like, a G.I. Joe game, and then all of a sudden there's Rambo.
Yeah.
Fucking every Hasbro property in a goddamn, like, Super Robot Wars, like, game. That's either something incredibly amazing or incredibly cursed. I don't know what to agree with.
I don't know either. It gets weird.
But the Brave series did feature its own original Brave within it, called the Saint of Braves Bangan. If you were to look at, like, the synopsis behind its backstory and its design, and you have familiarity with the final TV anime Gao Gaigar, you can look at it as, like, Bangan is something of a continuation of various themes and motifs that were started with Gao Gaigar itself. And because of its inclusion in those games, and, like, seeing acknowledgement from Sunrise as almost like an honorary 9th Brave series. Like this could have been a potential, like, TV anime had the franchise continued past 97. But even then, there was still another entry that was poised to be the possible 9th Brave series, because lesser known than Bangan was a concept that was left unanimated, originally planned as the succeeding season to Gao Gaigar, and is known as Photogrizer. For the longest time, very little was ever known about it, like, for decades. The only thing that was known is that the robots, like, their transformation would be, they would turn into smaller everyday objects, some of which were based on, like, what were kind of new trending things at the time, like cell phones and digital cameras.
Which I would have liked to have seen how they could have done all of that, but
that is the thing, because decades later, I think for around the time when Sunrise was holding an event, like, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Brave series, they actually unveiled to everyone, like, in-house production sheets and concepts for what Photogrizer was supposed to be in more detail. And it reveals that it was going to be a hard shift. It was going to be like that cycle back I was talking about, back to, like, appealing to a younger audience, because it wasn't going to be like standard Kunio Okuwara designed robots that were miniature and turned into these handheld objects. It's like, no, they were, like, everyday objects that turned into, like, handheld mascotty looking robots. Like, imagine an entire series where all the robots look like the default form of Mike Saunders the 13th.
Oh, God.
A name that will become instantly familiar to everyone if you have watched Gao Gaigar. And if you haven't, we'll talk about that later. Don't you fucking worry.
Don't worry about it.
Yes, it was swerving back to being even more kids focused, while still having these everyday objects combined into a combining Brave robot that would then inexplicably, like, grow and expand in size to be, like, proper giant robot size.
Oh, of course.
It's weird.
Yeah.
It seems like a very weird fucking concept to follow up off of something so goddamn hot-blooded as Gal Gaigar.
Going from Gal Gagar and especially Gal Gagar Final to this that's like just pressing the big reset buttons. Like, just go back to the beginning, guys.
Yeah, that's at least as far as just like Brave adjacent stuff that they were like trying to do, or not adjacent. It was explicitly part of the Brave series, even if it was not a TV anime. There was definitely other things that were being made shortly after to be adjacent to the Brave series and like carry on its spirit. I mentioned the various works of Mitsuo Fukuda, besides his most infamous one, but one of those is Gear Fighter Dendo, because that is a super robot anime that is, it's kid oriented, not necessarily as like X Kaiser levels of kid oriented, but very much the sort of thing where it is like a simple but like effective kind of story that like carries on a lot of like ideals that the Brave series started. Not so much with like, sentient transforming robots that have personality, but very much the sort of thing where it's like they wanted something with like kid protagonists that would feel like involved and like have like a simple but effective dramatic story. It didn't spawn a new franchise as they would hope, but it was, from what I could gather, it was very well received for the time. Like the whole idea is like two like kids that are like the pilots of like the titular robot, and it can only be piloted with those two. So you could see how there would be like this kind of story that they put together where these kids are polar opposites of each other and have to like come and like realize their differences and work together. Like imagine like a predecessor to the concept of Futari wa Pretty Cure, but with a giant robot instead of magical girls. And even so, a lot of the stuff that we talked about as far as the impact and legacy, obviously that's been stuff that is very explicitly like within the realm of like Japan itself, because that is where it aired. But we mentioned like the one Brave series that everyone knows, and that is because internationally, the Brave series is largely recognized by anime fans for the King of Braves, Gal Gaigar specifically. It is the show that both of us as hosts have watched. In fact, it's the first of anything from the Brave series that we ever watched, because it was just that well known due to like basically recognition from various crossover works like the Super Robot Wars series, Alpha 2 and 3. In particular on the PS2 was like its breakout moment, and I think for the longest time became like the face of the Brave series internationally, because no other Brave robot was featured in Super Robot Wars prior, and for the longest time it basically remained like, yeah, Gal Gaigar is the go-to. It took until only, I think, like the international games, like the ones where they finally started putting out official English translations, that they started expanding to include some of the other ones. And I imagine part of that difficulty was due to the fact that like some of these are extremely kid focused in like their intent, but also it's like, how do you rope like these robots and their human characters and like get them into the universe spanning like end of all existence plots that the cast of Super Robot Wars has to contend with. I don't think Dr. Hell would be fond of having to work with the Geisters.
I don't think so either. I don't think anybody would want to like deal with the Geisters, but I would like to see that.
And even then, like on the good guy side, I still have a hard time imagining like how you could like get away for a reasonable long amount of time with like Kota just being away from everyone else in his life and his family and just going on like a universe spanning like trek to save all of existence.
It would be a big tonal shift for that show.
Obviously, some like kind of fit better, as we mentioned, because like stuff like Might Gein and Jay Decker have recently been featured, and those are able to work a lot better, both in terms of their human characters, but also just like the designs and motifs of their robots themselves.
Yeah. Also, another thing about Gal Gaigar is that the reason why that was the first one I watched was because at the time, it was the most accessible Brave series, because everything else was, good luck, I guess. I hope you know Japanese. Or hope somebody subtitled.
Yeah, translations were just not readily available for those. One of them was like very infamous for the longest time of like not having good like translation subtitles at all. Like it wasn't until like 2024, like earlier in the year that we're recording this, that they actually that someone finally got around to like fixing up all like the scrambled like subtitle translation packs that had existed over the years and finally made them consistent.
Yeah. Anybody who's getting into mecha anime this year, is going to be in a better spot than us because you have so many more options now.
Absolutely. But more important things to get into about the Brave series influence. We mentioned all the way at the beginning about Transformers, kind of like the Brave series ties to being born out of Takara's work on Transformers and wanting to have basically their own in-house version of that without like the involvement of Hasbro. And in a way that is like totally circular as always, a lot of the Brave series pioneering traits found their way coming back into the Transformers line itself. And that's most noticeable, I would say, when you got to the Transformers like animated series that were like very clearly anime produced in Japan, because I mentioned the name the Unicron trilogy, which is like basically referring to like a series of like 3 different like Transformers anime from the early 2000s. Probably most notable of those 3 was Transformers Armada. I remember watching that as a kid. It was on Toonami in the early 2000s. I didn't know any better. It was my first Transformers anything, really. But it's the sort of thing where, like, even though I have no desire to ever rewatch that show in full because I'm aware of, like, how shoddy its production is and the fact that, like, its English dub and translation was especially roughshod. After having watched Brave X Kaiser a couple years back and then looking back into my memories of like what I recall from Transformers Armada, it suddenly became a lot clearer at just, oh yeah, this thing is actually more influential than people could ever have fucking guessed, because Armada just rocks the multi-unit combination concept. The Transformers are not just transforming into between 2 modes, they are also combining with either smaller or bigger robots to like access new powers or create like an even bigger robot form. And even the emphasis on interactions with human protagonists was also infamously a big part of Armada and its subsequent entries, to the point where I think for the longest time you had so many Transformers fans just like, it seemed like the common knowledge at the time was like, this is a bad idea in concept, the Transformers should only be about the Transformers, which I get it. G1 Transformers did literally nothing with the Witwikis.
No, it sure didn't.
But like after watching so many of the Brave series and even like talking with people I know who are bigger Transformers fans than I am and have like kept up with the series going into like the 2010s, that I'm like, time I think has proven that no, that original train of thought was clearly bullshit. It can work. You just need people that actually know how to do it well.
Yeah.
Because the Brave series did it well, and from what I remember talking with people is that Transformers Prime, the CG animated show from the early 2010s, had like a lot of like human Transformers like interactions and dynamics that was actually handled very well, from what I was told.
Yeah, it's that, and also like the recent comics, especially the Skybound comics, where it's more about the dynamics of the Transformers and the humans, and it's actually an interesting dynamic of, oh, how do these people deal with these robots and their different like culture and all that, and dealing with their bullshit as well, the whole war.
Transformers Cybertron actually has an homage to the finale of X Kaiser in its final battle. It's basically a shot of Optimus and Megatron facing off against each other, like just facing each other while on the moon with like the Earth dead center in the background. And that exact same shot is the stage for the final battle of X Kaiser.
They're not even being subtle about it, about their influence.
Definitely not. No. While still beloved in Japan, major attempts to create a new Brave TV series, they've just never come to pass. And with how long it's been, since the 90s, it probably would be very hard to. And I'm not even sure if I would necessarily want a new TV anime series because of how so closely tied it feels to like the technology and style and like animation techniques of the 90s.
Yeah.
But that certainly has not stopped Sunrise from celebrating anniversary milestones whenever they can, especially since right now, for the past decade and a half, it's like, or 2 decades almost, it's like they have, I think, have full ownership of everything about the Brave series. Like it's like, even though it was started as like a joint venture with Takara because of them producing the toys, it's now the sort of thing where it's like Takara no longer really has like a big hold on it or is like doing anything to prevent like a new anime coming out. It's like, no, all those rights are completely sold off to Sunrise, and by extension that means like all like the companies that own them now, which is like Bandai, Namco Bandai, etc. So that's why they're able to at least get away with like still licensing out the Brave series for crossover works or showing off never before seen like animations, or even just in the case of some like 30th anniversary stuff, like cleaning up like old key animations in like proper HD, selling them on a Blu-ray box with like a brand new song made by Masaki Endo that is just like in celebration about the Brave series and what they have taught us.
That's pretty good.
But also extending from that 30th anniversary, believe it or not, a new Brave series was greenlit in the form of a web manga. It entered publication in 2023. It did not obviously start the moment that the 30th anniversary rolled around, but the idea of like, we'll explain it more in subsequent entries, but it is very much a celebratory crossover type of story. Shows all the Brave shows that you remember while also doing some deep cuts into like niche kind of out of the way stuff that came in the wake of like the TV series like basically ending. So even now, you still find Super Robot anime that have adopted the ideas and themes that the Brave series popularized in the 90s. You know, like it might be new television programming for kids like Shinkalyan, which is like just a show that's all about, you know, what if Shinkansen trains that were piloted by kids that could turn into giant robots because kids love trains.
Yeah.
Or you could even have like new Super Robot anime that's directed by series alum like Masami Obari. He sure as hell did that.
Yeah, Bang Bravern is not an official Brave series, but it's might as well be. It is the Brave show that was made for adults that grew up on the Brave series, is how I'll put it.
Yes. Like, you look at the logo for Bang Bravern, and it is like, oh man, I can't get too ahead of myself right now because, like, we need to save this for that episode.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about Bravern.
Oh, me too. Yes. And even then, that's not the only thing he's directed. Yeah. He's obviously directed other stuff like Gravion, which we won't talk about. It wasn't worthy of being on the list, but it's kind of a guilty pleasure. You watch it and look at the animations for when Gravion is like transforming and combining, and you're like, oh yeah, that's the Brave series. That's his work.
Yeah, we didn't mention it, but another thing Obari is known for is he does a lot of TNA as well, and you definitely see it in shows like Gravion.
Yeah, you do. And you definitely get some fan service in Bravern as well, but it is a much different kind of fan service.
Oh, it's for all the Bara lovers out there.
Oh yeah. But yeah, like new anime of different types, even collector toys and plastic model kits that still get made today. Like even Bangan has had like a model kit produced by Kotobukiya of all things. It's like all this stuff still being made to this day. It simply cements the Brave series status in the history of the genre, even though in contrast to like the past 3 mega series we talked about, it's like it burned bright, and because of how bright it burned, it also meant that it extinguished just as fast, which is kind of a shame because you can always expect Mazinger to continue. Gundam is never going to die. You can expect a Macross series to get a new TV anime at least every decade, but you're just never going to get a new Brave anime.
Nope.
That's just how it is.
You're going to get series inspired by the Brave series, but not a new one.
And, you know, with how much time passes and, like, animation techniques and, like, technology changes and, hell, even the way that, like, anime is produced and distributed these days with, like, the whole season scheduling and whatnot, maybe it'd be for the best that it doesn't come back.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider what the final TV anime entry was and what they were initially planning on following it up with. That if it had to go out, I'm at least glad it went out on the bang that it did.
Oh, yeah.
But we might as well cover, as we're nearing the end of this episode, we got to get to the subsequent entries. We got to explain everything between X-Kaiser and the end.
And this is going to all be new to me as well.
And as we mentioned before, with how we talked about X-Kaiser, the recommendation angle for that is obviously like maybe watch a few episodes, the beginning, middle, and end, and maybe like a few select ones. It's kind of the same thing I would say is like much in the same way that you would never binge watch all of the original Mazinger Z anime.
Yeah.
It is very much in that same vein, maybe aiming a bit more towards a kid angle compared to even Mazinger Z was, but even with its kid focus, there is still like some genuinely funny bits and like clever writing and stuff that occasionally crops up, as well as absolutely insane scenarios like shirtless buff Santa.
At least watch that episode.
Definitely watch that. Like, watch it every time Christmas rolls around and you will have a jolly old time. But as far as subsequent entries, a lot of them, at least the ones I have gone through, fare much better and are much more recommendable by comparison, such as Brave Fighter of Sun Firebird, which aired in 1991. Uses a similar setup to X-Kaiser's plot and characters, you know, like alien cosmic entities coming to Earth, you know, one faction wanting to fuck shit up, the others trying to stop them, good guys versus bad guys. But it's got some noticeable twists that are mostly to like enhance the comedy factor, but some stuff as well that like increases the stakes during like dramatic story arcs. For better or worse, with Firebird, its most defining aspect is the internet meme, which screen caps a scene of protagonist Katori, which is the human disguise of Firebird, holding his hand towards a butterfly and asking, "Is this a pigeon?"
That's right, y'all. That's where this meme came from. It was from a mecha anime in the 90s.
And that subtitle, you might think with how often this meme gets like edited to hell and back that even the original was an edit. Oh no. It's not. The full context is even sillier because Firebird's whole deal when he's in disguise as a human, because, you know, our hero robot is not disguised as a car. He's disguised as a human android, which is where the comedy factor comes in because he's learning how to be human. He can't just be like an outsider looking in. He has to interact, even if it makes a fool out of himself when he goes, "Nature is so beautiful. Ah, is this a pigeon?" as he motions to a butterfly. "Are these tulips?" as he motions to daisies. And he says all this in front of a very angry police inspector who is trying to like catch one of the main cast, who's like an old grandpa inventor, on charges of like a bank theft that he did not do because he seems suspiciously wealthy despite being low income, which is okay, so here's the genius thing about Firebird. The reason the heroes are able to do what they are able to do is because of tax fraud.
Really? Is that it?
Yes. In the final moments of the show, when the villains are about to completely destroy the world and like everyone in the community is coming together to help Firebird, and that means basically blowing the whole lid on like, yes, our human characters know who Firebird is as well as all these other transforming robots. We need to help them to save the world. And someone asks the old man inventor, it's like, you had all these crazy robots doing all this cool stuff, helping the world. Why didn't you want anyone to know? And how did you even make all this stuff? And he's like, "Oh, I sold off the land that I inherited from my family, but didn't mention it on the inheritance tax." Our heroes, ladies and gentlemen, our grandpa tax fraud inventor and his grandkids.
I love that they kept that for the final episodes.
And that's how you know that this was when the show was starting to grow up a bit more and just be like, okay, we don't need to be purely for kids.
Yeah.
We can sneak in a few more things so that the older viewers, most likely the parents, because in an ideal scenario, the parents would be watching this stuff with their kids instead of just leaving the TV on as a babysitter.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you want to at least have something for, like, the parents to also still be engaged with. And nothing engages people more than just, like...
tax fraud.
Like, seemingly harmless crime like tax fraud.
Yeah, I'm sure the parents got a lot of amusement out of that one.
But following that is The Brave of Legend, The Garn. Aired in 1992, and the last of the Brave anime directed by Katsuyoshi Yatape. So, yeah, we went from X-Kaiser, which is like solid enough but repetitive kid show, Brave Fighter of Sun Firebird, which is, you know, still following the same formula, but has a lot more shakeups added to the formula that makes it a lot more watchable. And I would say, if you're still fine with Monster of the Week stuff and like episodic and the episodic nature of these type of shows to begin with, Firebird's a lot more watchable than X-Kaiser. The Garn, meanwhile, is notable for being the first Brave series with an overarching narrative that runs through the entire series. So even when you still have your obligatory Monster of the Week, like robot fights at the end of the episode, it's still moving the plot forward, and it's still building up a lot of drama and escalation. even further replicated by the fact that like the kid protagonist is even older than what had been shown in the series prior. Like Seiji, the main character, is a 5th grader who's like turning on 6th grader by the end of the show. Or actually, he turned 6th grader like very early on in the show's runtime. But regardless, he's getting to that adolescent point that it makes the character more interesting. And this is where I'd say, regardless of like how long these shows are, because they are always close to 50 episodes, if there is one Brave series that you want to get into that is as close to the origin of the franchise without going straight to X-Kaiser, I would say watch The Brave of Legend Dagarn. We're not going to have an episode where we talk about Dagarn, unfortunately, because it is a very big time investment. Yeah. There are other Brave series that I think are like better to work on, and this is another one of those where I had to make a personal sacrifice because I absolutely love this show. I did not expect to ever really love it as much as I did. But I was just surprised by how good of a show it was, especially with it going all the way to having like basically a really good environmentalism message without being preachy about it.
Which is a really impressive feat.
Yeah, like Captain Planet, this is not, because it actually knows to not be so on the nose like Captain Planet. Yeah, there's some really good stuff in there because, yeah, like the villains get cycled out as the show goes on, with some even returning. The Braves' origins are even different. They don't come from space. They are instead like spirits from the Earth itself that inhabit inanimate objects, thus kind of feeding into an idea that the show's theme is about the Earth. You know, it is about the planet we all live on and kind of the importance of preserving it without getting into the same boring, preachy nonsense that a lot of environmentalism messages try to go with. And I think this is like the first Brave series where it's like I've noticed there's at least more than one like truly recognizable and like standout voice actor kind of on the roster. Like Sho Hayami actually returns to voice the titular Dagarn, which is interesting. I'm actually not as this might seem weird considering how much I love Dagarn, but I'm not as in love with like the robot designs overall.
Oh wow!
But I think that's just a case of like they still feel too familiar to what was established prior. But it's really like the other characters and their personalities that make it, as well as their voices. And the main character, Seiji, is voiced by Rika Matsumoto, the Japanese voice of Ash Ketchum, known as Satoshi in the Pokemon anime, and one of the early members of Jam Project.
Who I believe becomes very prolific after this one.
Yes, I forget if she had any other roles before Dagarn, but like this is definitely one where it's like this might be the earliest like big role for her, like not counting breakout set for life type of role that she got with the Pokemon anime.
Oh yeah.
But it's the sort of thing where like hearing the voice and like, even though, you know, I never grew up with like the Japanese dub of the Pokemon anime, I barely have experience with it, but like just looking at clips of it and then looking back at her performance as Seiji in Dagarn, it's like, oh yeah, I see the connection. Yeah, it's like she's a good voice actor and a good singer. You know, it's like you could definitely feel her presence in like those early Jam Project songs from like the mid 2000s. It's good. Like we may not have a full episode dedicated to it, but trust me when I say it, please do watch Dagarn. Like seek it out if you can, especially because this is like the end of, you know, Yatabei's like run as director and kind of the end of like a lot of familiar concepts in the Brave series that were started with X-Kaiser before it got a major shakeup in our 4th entry, Brave Express Might Gain, possibly the next most recognizable Brave entry after Gao Gaigar, especially if we're going by it was the next one to be featured in Super Robot Wars after the longest fucking time.
Yeah, that's how I learned about the series. It was all from Super Robot Wars.
And even then, I think in Japan specifically, I think Might Gain still might be it either is still or was at an earlier point in time considered the most popular Brave series in Japan specifically by viewers. But Might Gain, it's the first Brave series directed by Shinji Takamatsu, who would then go on to direct the following 2 Brave series after this, and would start, you know, his signature trait of incorporating a sub-theme into all of his works on the Brave series. And the sub-theme of Might Gain is justice. You know, the concept of like prevailing over like adversity, good versus evil. Justice always prevails in the end. Whoever's on the side of justice, all that stuff. Yeah. It's the sort of sub-theme that works for what Might Gain is going for, which is feeling the most like a traditional Super Robot anime, as like there's a huge like involvement, not just with the titular sentient robot Gain, which becomes Might Gain, but also the human protagonist Maito Shinpuji, who like pilots his own robot that combines with Gain in order to create the titular Might Gain. And the combinations in Might Gain just get fucking crazier and crazier at this point, almost as a sort of, I feel some people have tried to make the argument that it is a very deliberate type of challenge at Takara themselves, to be like, see if you can make a combining robot that has all this shit.
Also, I believe, I guess this is the spoilers for the end of Might Gain, but the ending is very controversial, isn't it?
It's a weird thing. Like, I was definitely bracing for, like, what that controversial ending might be, but I found it like kind of tame. I think part of it might have just been more informed by stuff that is very hard for me to source where it actually came from in like interviews or whatever. All I have is just like hearsay that has been on the internet for decades from like what Shinji Takamatsu has said from like his time working on like these Brave entries, and it always seems to imply that he might not have been particularly fond of like the sort of relationship and foundation that the Brave series was built on between Sunrise and Takara.
Right.
The fact that it is so very explicitly tied to like selling toys. Because the villain, the ultimate villain of Might Gain is less, it's funny, I was almost thinking it was going to be more of just like a very on the nose like acknowledgement of like, oh, like the villain is actually like the head of like a multi-dimensional like toy company and that all these characters are toys. And no, it's more like just acknowledging the fact that like this is an anime, this is fiction, and that the villain is actually an entity outside of the world of Might Gain, essentially from the world of 3D, as it calls itself, because Might Gain is in the realm of 2D. So I think it's more a case of just trying to take that at Takara over having the Brave series be so tied to being like a toy commercial, like an overly long toy commercial for a half-hour time slot. But the other thing might have just been to be like, even though this is a kids anime series where we're cycling out new stories and characters every year, we don't want people to be like disposing of these concepts. You know, these are still people. And it's weird too because of how like the credits at the end of the final episode pans out from a shot of an animation cell on like an animator's desk of like the final shot from the anime. And it's just kind of zooming out, just kind of showing that like, yes, all of this was created on a cell. This is animation, but this is still real to us, damn it.
Which is, it's crazy to me that that's how they ended a show that's meant for like young kids.
And the thing is, though, it still ends in a way where it feels like it reaches the typical conclusion that you would expect it to. Like, that's the thing. I think that's why the ending did not strike me as being as controversial as people made it out to be. The controversy was just more in the villain's final speech and like his motive as far as like what this universe is and like what he's doing with it.
Right, yeah.
Like I think it's a case where I think even for like a kid's show, this might have been something where Takamatsu was maybe aiming a bit too high for that.
Yeah, it might have been like, oh, this might go over a lot of kids' heads.
And might not be sending as strong a message as he could, especially because I think the sub-theme of justice is a bit too vague for like ways in which you can explore it. Because our next entry, Brave Police J. Decker, does a better job, I think, of its sub-theme concept. So J. Decker aired in 94. It's the second of Takamatsu's Brave series, and its sub-theme is heart. The show like basically models itself after, you know, police procedurals and placed emphasis on the Brave robots being human-made constructs with like super advanced AI. Which, by the way, I forgot to mention, Might Gain also introduced the idea of the Brave robots being like products of human science with AI. This just gets way more emphasis in J. Decker because the AI ends up giving it a lot more human features in a context where the police are initially wanting a super precise, always perfect police force made of robots, but the robots end up getting AI that makes them more human-like, which, you know, makes them more likable and approachable by the other humans they work with, except for the people on the board that are like, what the fuck, this isn't what we paid for. that they're showing all the same flaws and inaccuracies that we humans do. So that's what it's exploring. It's basically the kind of sci-fi story of exploring what it means to be human in a kid's show. And it does that, I think, way better than whatever Takamatsu was trying to aim for with like the final motivation of the villain in Might Gain, because like this is another amazing show. This is like the next one that I would recommend after Dagarn personally, because it's like the show's like cast, it is extremely wide and varied. This is the first Brave show where you can call this like an ensemble cast,
Right.
because every Brave robot feels incredibly distinct from each other. Like, it feels the most like they have clear personalities and motivations and ideas that extend beyond I'm the leader, or I'm the leader of Sub-Team 1, and so on and so forth. And that interplay with its human cast and all kinds of other mini arcs that will just be like, yeah, we're just going to focus on these two random cast members for this one episode and put them through an interesting scenario. Like, it's definitely one of those that makes better use of the episodic nature of these shows. Yeah, definitely check it out. And it's also been featured in Super Robot Wars, finally. Like, as of Super Robot Wars 30. Like, Might Gain, and Gao Gaigar all in the same game. Like, what a world.
Yeah. We're finally getting more Brave series representation.
And the next couple that we're going to talk about, this is where we kind of get into stuff where, at least with this one, I have not finished watching yet. I'm still kind of in the process of. And it is The Brave of Gold, Goldran. Aired in 1995, the final Takamatsu directed Brave series, and the sub-theme it incorporates is adventure. You can imagine with this that what the concept of adventure is, compared to previous works, it is a much more lighthearted and simplified story. It's a lot more on comedic misadventures of 3 elementary school boys going around the world searching for clues that will lead to like this hidden treasure in a mysterious land known as Legendra. And all the while, they're like basically racing against this villain that is also trying to find the hidden treasure. And it's the sort of thing where the villain is an idiot because he has all the power he needs in order to just like wipe out the kids and just take everything for himself. But he's like, no, let's make it a game so I can outwit them with my superior intellect.
Oh, God.
Yes, this show, I've only gotten like a third of the way through at the moment, but like, it is really episodic in nature. Like, this is getting back to something where you're not really going to do it much favors if you try to binge watch it as fast as you can. There's little focus on an overarching narrative, but like, its focus on comedy, I think, is done really well from the episodes I've seen. Like, there is some amazingly funny shit that happens in it. I guess it's interesting to look at, ultimately, that Takamatsu's, like, 3 different Brave series are like not all just the same, like building on previous themes the same way that Yatapei's like building on the first 3 entries of the Brave series played out. Like, it was actually kind of challenging things a bit more. But yeah, I can't really give a full recommendation on like Goldran as far as like a complete product, but I mean, fuck it, I'm going through it right now, and like, slow as I'm taking my time with it, it's still pretty funny. That said, the next Brave series is one that I naturally have not watched any of and will not get to for a while, and that is Brave Command Dogwan. Aired in 1996, Dogwan was the penultimate Brave series TV anime and was not directed by Yatabe or Takamatsu, instead directed by Tomomi Mochizuki, and this is, I'm pretty sure, his only contribution to the Brave series as far as director. And it's an outlier just from everything I've seen on the surface.
Really?
Like, in terms of aesthetic and feel, most I could say about it is that it's very different in like its audience focus. Like, there's an emphasis on a group of teenagers with attitude. I mean, that can transform and fight as giant robots. In a weird way, I think this might be, unless I'm mistaken, and it could be cleared up when I finally watch it, but I feel like from what I've read of the synopsis, Dogwan feels like this might be the first instance of like Brave robots as a product of fusion.
Oh.
Because of the fact that it is a cast of like teenage boys that have like their own like henshin forms and whatnot, like powered suits that they fight in, but then eventually build up to where they actually like combine with a robot that actually they take control of. Or maybe they like transform their entire body into the robot itself. I forget. But yes, I do feel like from what little details I've gotten that it feels like the birth of like that final concept of the Brave robots, where they're not cosmic life forms. They are not products of like science with super advanced AI. It is instead like the infusing of the human body and soul with like a giant robot. As you'd expect with how different it is, this one actually was not so popular with its original demographic. But it did, however, become popular with a different group. Stop me if you've heard this before. A following from a young female audience.
Yeah, if you look at the character designs for the main characters, this has a very big Fujoshi factor to it. They're all pretty boys.
Yep. Girls love pretty boys. It goes without saying. Gundam Wing proved this.
Mm-hmm.
It did receive 2 OVA episodes additionally, which is something I've heard even less about because like no Brave anime up to this point even had that. Like you wouldn't really think to do that for like something that would be so focused on like being like a kid's show. But I guess that also goes to show that Dagwon's aiming for something a lot different in many ways. And then there's Gao Gaigar.
Yeah.
Well, which we've obviously gushed about as much as we can without just talking about it for the majority of the podcast. But at least what I could say about this, aired in 97. It's the most well-known Brave series internationally. Its director is Yoshitomo Yonetani. And whether it was by design or not, this anime feels like the culmination of major concepts that existed in the Brave series prior and amplifies them all to absurd degrees. Like, me going on my own personal journey, watching the earlier Brave entries, like, it feels a lot like every time I've gone through them, I've been able to point out something where it feels like, oh yeah, this gets iterated on again in Gao Gaigar or like pushed to the next level, like the Ultra Rakers, like combination like method being used for symmetrical docking. Dagarn has like a rival robot, which I didn't even talk about Seven Change. Fuck. Okay. Here's the short of it. You remember Seven Force from Gunstar Heroes? It's that. It's the predecessor.
There you go. That's your that's your description. That's what you get. That's what you get.
Good. Yeah. That's another fucking reason for why you need to watch Dagarn. Thank you. But yes, a rival robot. The whole fusion concept from Dagwon, there's like the whole ensemble cast feeling with like the distinct nature of the robots that you see in like J-Decker. The main human protagonist is also has the same voice actor from Mike Kind, Nobuyuki Hiyama, the one of the goats, and just oh my god, it is overflowing with like the series core theme. Like courage is a concept that like the show has from the beginning, but it never like overly emphasizes it with like the word or like the ideals behind it. Gao Gaigar decided to just lean into it, and courage is the solution to all problems.
They are constantly shouting about courage all the fucking time in this show, and it's peak.
Yes, it is beautiful. Like more than Might Guy, this is where, and I think also this contributes to why it was first to appear in Super Robot Wars, is that this is the most Super Robot-like in its traditions.
Yeah, it's still very episodic, but it's so bombastic and just, it's such an entertaining show to go through.
You've got your hot-blooded protagonist, you have your like support team that is in charge of maintaining the robots, you got like all the cool finishing moves. Like the human character is like piloting the robot, pilot, quote unquote. Again, more of a fusion, but it's so good. It's to the point where it's like the first time you watch it feels so funny. I look back on like what my thoughts were when I first watched Gao Gaigar and just being like, this is a cool super robot. And then I saw some of the other support robots and I'm like, what's a transformer doing here?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And little did I know about this series origins until a decade later.
Until now we're doing a podcast about it, about mechas at least.
Yes.
Also, I should mention Gao Gaigar is the reason why I fell into the mecha hole in the first place. So this show means a lot to me in that regard.
Oh, mine is, well, it's a different one, but we'll get to an episode very soon. Well, I'll say it as far as like what was like the turning point that got me even deeper. But Gao Gaigar is a hell of a good one.
Yeah.
It did have an OVA as well, a sequel OVA called Gao Gaigar Final. And a spin-off series that was aimed at adults, which I've never looked at because it's not really mecha focused, but it takes place in the same universe. It's called Better Man. We can't really say anything about Better Man. It's outside the scope of like what this podcast's focus is on.
Yeah.
Gao Gaigar, we're obviously going to have an episode on this. No shit.
Talk about it.
But well, like when we talk about this, it'll become very clear. Like we're specifically going to talk about just Gao Gaigar. Final, meanwhile, is like you watch that once you know that you have seen Gao Gaigar, love it, and you need more of it. You know, there's little points in like trying to talk about that OVA in detail without first going into the thing that came before and establishes why it's so beloved. Kind of one of those early examples you can think of just like super robot shows really, really starting to push the envelope before other stuff in the 2000s decided to run with that idea. I feel like it very much originated with Final. And then lastly, not an anime, but we mentioned as much that this was something that was announced for the 30th anniversary of the Brave series, and that is the web manga Brave Universe Swarg Raider. It entered publication in 2023. Originated of the idea came from Gao Geiger's director for what is basically a crossover story, bringing all the Braves together across universes to fight all of the franchise's villains, as well as the new ultimate villain that is bringing them all together. And like, not only does it introduce a brand new Brave that is like the titular Swarg Raider, as well as its own human characters, but like, it brings back not only like the past universes and robots from the ATV anime, it also brings in Bangan from the Brave saga, and it even brings in Photogreiser. It's ongoing at the moment, and there are scanlations showing up whenever available. I have read all the chapters that are currently up to date, and like the first several chapters, they spend not only a lot of time obviously introducing Swarg Raider itself, I guess just because, you know, there was no anime for these two to get people familiar with them. They do a lot to kind of emphasize that, yes, Bangan and Photogreiser are legit Braves, especially Photogreiser. So we like take the time to actually show what these series were about before we get back to crossing over with the TV anime you are familiar with. It's an interesting thing, and obviously because of how long it takes for like chapters and then translations to come out, it's like I'm not in too much of a hurry to like see where it goes, but I was at least entertained. At the very least, I think I'm fine with like the Brave series continuing in manga form, because that means we just get to see more beautiful 2D art of the Brave robots themselves. Channel those Obari-isms, please. And it's not on the subsequent entries, but this is kind of adjacent to it, because this goes to show like how much the Brave series means to like an entire generation of people in Japan. It's difficult to call this a manga because it was never one that received like actual publication or release. It was more like just a series of like comic sketches by a manga artist that was just brainstorming an idea, like one of those, wouldn't it be cool if blank, you know, like this sort of thing where the happen, where even though there's no chance of it. And it was the artist for the manga adaptation of Knights and Magic, which was a light novel and also had an anime. We'll also talk about that later on in this podcast program. But the idea was, what if there was a Brave series where the Brave robot was isekai to another world? And the ideas that are sketched up are actually fucking amazing, and I wish we could have that.
I would have watched that. That sounds incredible.
It's like, look up like the title Isekai Yusha G-Shine. I believe that's the title of it. Like all of it's been like translated, and like those sketches and stuff been put up on like your manga reading website of choice, MangaDex or whatever. And it's real fun to just look at it and just be like, here are all a bunch of like snippets, little vignettes of like what these dramatic or cool moments would be like if this had been made into like a 50 episode anime that was like what if the Brave series never left and we just started taking more trends from elsewhere and infusing it with the Brave series like concept of courage, because that's another thing. G-Shine also likes to emphasize the word courage much in the same way Gao Geiger does.
Yeah, like I think even if we don't get a new like Brave series ever again, I'm fine with series that are just influenced them. I'll even take a new Bravern or Bravern sequel or whatever, you know what I mean,
or even just something else new entirely. You know, like someone else steps up and just be like, I want to make my own sentient transforming robot idea. Have something that is very positive and wholesome, because that's really the ultimate thing. Like in a decade where you saw like a lot more like not just real robot stuff continuing with like more grown-up like adult themes and whatever, but also super robot stuff being made that was like still aiming at adults, or even like being very subversive or like upending certain ideas. The Brave series was literally just a bright spot throughout that entire decade of just reminding that like there is still room for kind of more wholesome and straightforward stuff, and that there is always room for that stuff as long as it's well made. And the Brave series on the whole is well made. Obviously it is not something where you can just sit down and watch everything quickly and be done, But at the same time, 8 seasons of like less than 400 episodes, that's still less than the entirety of Super Sentai or Kamen Rider.
Oh yeah, y'all, if you thought like mecha shows are hard to get into, fucking try to get to a Sentai show. All of those shows are like 50 fucking episodes.
And the worst part is, when it comes to recommendations for those, it's not even like you're hard pressed to find one that's good. It's more like there are too many good ones for you to actually stick with.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
The real answer is you should watch Dawn Brothers if you want a Sentai show. Anyways.
I was about to say watch Gokaiger, but I guess that works
Either
too.
of those works.
But yeah, like those Toei Tokusatsus are a lot harder to get into just because of how many things there are. Mm-hmm. To a lesser degree, probably Pretty Cure as well, but I mean, that's also been running for like less time than either of those. So yeah, like the Brave series, daunting as it may be, it's still better than you would give it credit for. I mean, for fuck's sake, I only have to finish Goldran and then Dagwon, and then I am caught up.
You can always like watch one or two, or at least watch Gao Gaigar if you're gonna watch one.
Yeah, watch Gao Gaigar, watch The Garn, watch Jay Decker. Those are like the top 3 that I would recommend if you want like a maximum. Mm-hmm. This was fun. Thanks for being on here, Neff.
Of course.
And thank you everyone at home for listening, especially because we have now completed phase 1 of the podcast program. We have finished all of our overview episodes.
We did it.
All the big historically important mecha franchises that we needed to inform you about for the road ahead. That's done. We got it. So now we can get into the real meat of what this podcast is actually going to be about. Talking about one specific anime or manga in some cases, and just get real deep with it.
And as for what we're going to talk about next, it's as much a surprise to you all as it's going to be to us. We don't know yet.
It's a mystery. Yeah, we'll keep you on your toes, but I can at least give you a hint of like the following several episodes that we're going to be doing are all going to be for series that are directly related to what we have talked about for these 4 episodes. Yep. You could expect something from Mazinger or Gundam, Macross, and even the Brave series. So look forward to that when we start phase 2 with our proper in-depth discussions of these wonderful, wonderful anime. So look forward to that when it comes down the pipe. See you, everyone.
Take care, y'all.